let's talk about this. Let's talk about how it went. Chris Hayes, let me.
Rachel, I got a lot.
Okay. I
got a lot.
We got a long time. We got a special. So tell us. Start at the top.
Well, I mean, I found it. I guess sort of viscerally, I found it one of those maybe a handful of moments over the last 8 years that felt like genuine vertigo, like almost a physical sensation of like, am I losing my mind here? Like what? Whoa, what's going on? There's something wrong about this. And why did this sort of give this sense of distress? And I think the reason is this. Donald Trump's framing of this prosecution is that what is extraordinary about it is the fact of the prosecution. Whereas the lower courts and the rest of us, I believe, that what's extraordinary are the actions he took to warrant the prosecution. What is unprecedented here are the actions at issue, which is the first attempt to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power since the cannons fired at Fort Sumter. Not that an indictment was brought. But from the very first moments, the conservatives in the court and in the framing of the question adopted the notion that what is new here and extraordinary needs to be justification is the prosecution itself. And in so doing, what they did was, as you said quite well, adopted the most cynical sort of authoritarian and relativistic view of all this that Trump himself adopts, which is, well, any prosecutor can prosecute anyone for anything. Anyone, and we saw this in the Colorado case as well. This assumption that everyone below this court, these austere gentlemen with their impeccable vision, everyone below them are political hacks. Well, the Colorado Supreme Court, they just don't want Trump on the ballot. And what if a red state court gets him off the ballot? And any prosecutor could prosecute anyone. And what happens next? A Democrat gets prosecuted by a Republican. And all these political hacks everywhere. We are the only ones who see clearly. We don't trust all this other process happening beneath us, the district court and the appellate court and the grand jury and the prosecutor and the Department of Justice and the attorney general and the duly elected president who appointed him and the Colorado Supreme Court. No, all of that, no. We get to say, never considering that they're the political hacks. That the people who are actually engaging in regular order here are all these lower bodies that have produced this to this situation. And in so doing, what it felt like was almost a philosophical endorsement of the worst aspects of Trumpism.
Yes.
Which is that this is all just power politics by another name.
Yes.
That none of this actually adheres to any set of regularity or rules of law. That the reason that this hasn't happened before is because there's never been as partisan a prosecutor as Jack Smith. Right. That's what's unprecedented here. Right. That it's not because of what he did. And so to walk into the third branch of government and these people with all this power, the creative minds who brought you 12-year-old giving birth to her rapist child, that to listen to these folks and find them in the highest halls of power adopting the most authoritarian and cynical vision of this was a genuinely shocking experience.
Lawrence O'Donnell, I want to go to you next, and I will foreshadow what's about to happen here. Katie was in the courtroom and heard the arguments. Ari is a lawyer, just like Katie. We're going to make you guys go last in bat cleanup. But I'm feeling like I have as much anxiety about this as you do, Chris. I want to go to you, Lawrence, because you are the man who usually tells us that we're overreacting. Yes, exactly. I would like you to throw cold water on my feelings and Chris's.
You know.
So there's no cause for alarm in any of this.
God bless you, my child.
As long as Joe Biden is reelected. Because if that was a given fact, if he was running with, say, the 18-point lead in the polls that Bill Clinton had at a certain point in his reelection campaign, there would be a lot less nervousness about this because we would know eventually this process will work. And if they send it back to Judge Chutkan can actually have an evidentiary hearing and actually bring witnesses in a way that she can't now. And so there would then be some actual under oath testimony about all this stuff before the election, if they do that. And then eventually you'd get through all this prosecution. I actually think Joe Biden is going to be reelected, so I'm not terribly concerned about what they're going to do in terms of slowing this thing down. But what you saw, the fundamentals of what you saw, and what we discovered clearly today, is that there is a group on the Supreme Court who believe that their duty is to protect the Constitution and the law, and there's a possibly larger group who believe their duty is to protect the president, not all presidents, the president named Trump. And that intensity launches those fever dreams that we heard from Alito and Gorsuch about every president now will make sure that their predecessor is prosecuted. They were adopting the Trump notion, by the way, that this is a Biden prosecution, and that then the next administration will obviously prosecute the previous president. To do that, they had to completely ignore the 230 years of history that preceded the Donald Trump presidency. That all had to be ignored, and they did willfully ignore it. And these are guys who pretend that they're amateur, at least historians, who pay attention to all of these things. And so it was that tortured process. But what also emerged really clearly was not a single justice there bought the Trump argument. The Trump argument is not for selective immunity. It is for absolute immunity. And every one of them basically found a way of saying that's ridiculous. And the Alito way included that thing that you showed where he kept saying, I'm not talking about these facts. Now, the good side of that coin is these facts are so bad, I can't talk about them. That's the good side of that coin.
I think Thomas may be the exception. I think Thomas may think all presidents are criminals, and so all presidents need absolute immunity.
So that's the great mystery.
Because everybody's like me.
That's the great mystery. He didn't recuse himself, or maybe his definition of recusal is, I will talk the least. Clarence Thomas spoke only 3 times. He didn't ask a paragraph worth of questions. The only thing he raised that was outside of what anyone else mentioned was an issue that wasn't even before the court, which was the legitimacy of the appointment of Jack Smith. That's not even before the court. And Thomas asked about that. So he actually remains the most mysterious on the court today. We don't know what he thought.
I think as Ginny was showing, I think that we overthink them. I think when you work for a president or you work for power, you know that they're just guys and girls. And these particular guys consume all of this. And I think what was clear today is
popular media. And,
they will direct quote segments from all of these programs. Alito gives speeches in front of conservatives, and I'm sure that conservatives in the audience who don't watch any of our programs are like, what's he talking about? Chunks, paragraphs from all of your scripts I have heard in Alito's rants. They are bound to Trump in their feelings of being persecuted. To a person.
Yes.
And so in Trump's immunity claim, which has myriad legal implications and layers to it, they found common cause with the feeling of persecution. And that is what they spoke to today. That is where he found a receptive audience. What's amazing to me as a non-lawyer is that federal judge Carter out in California was like, the farther we get, the more murky it gets. But in the immediate aftermath, Trump clearly committed the crimes. And federal judges said more likely than not he committed felonies, he and that Eastman guy. And the further we get, the more the people at the highest levels of this branch that everyone said, oh, the court's held, the court's held. I think after today, we have to get rid of that notion that the court's held. And I think after today, we have to get rid of the notion that there's some complicated legal theory. They feel him. They feel persecuted just like he does.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a very dark day for the Supreme Court. I don't think the conservative justices comported themselves well, and to the extent that these arguments have a back and forth, I'm not sure the other side, for rule of law, moved it back enough. And I think this will matter in history because you're going to study some of these precedents. The last time we were all gathered here on a Supreme Court day, it was the Colorado case. And the reason legally, not politics, legally, that experts would say that was unlikely to go against Trump was that there wasn't any precedent for booting him off the ballot. Now we're gathered today. There's zero precedent for this kind of blanket immunity, and there's anti-precedent. Nixon and others taking pardons, and Robert Ray, who replaced Ken Starr, striking a deal with Bill Clinton on the understanding that otherwise he could be prosecuted. That's bipartisan examples there, different party presidents. And against all of that, the test is, okay, Trump might not benefit as much, but do the rules hold? Based on the questioning, and I agree with your caveat, the rules did not hold for most of the conservative justices. Justice Roberts has a slow grade scandal going. He's got the money and the corruption on one side, but he's also the Chief Justice overseeing an increasingly partisan MAGA court. And he can't just stand idly by. This is on him as well. One more point I did want to share that we didn't get to on official acts. There can be potential official acts that would be harder to prosecute. None of these are those.
Right.
So the fact that that could happen when you're dealing with war, or when you order a drone strike and it kills someone abroad, but it
Or
turns
the
out,
unreviewable pardon authority.
right.
Like there's some stuff.
Or you
Yeah.
make an order and it does take an American life, and you say, actually, we're not going to deal with that. This is not that. And I am reminded of the classic Aaron Sorkin line, a co-writer of Lawrence from Social Network. If you'd invented Facebook, you would have invented Facebook.
Right.
And if these were official acts, they would be official acts. And the reason, as you pointed out in the excellent opening, that none of the conservative justices wanted to go anywhere near their job, which is to review the law and find facts. They didn't want to go near the facts that it's not an official act to get people to storm the Capitol and try to assassinate the Vice President of the United States who works for you and the Speaker of the House is in the line of succession. It's not an official act when you're down by 3 states and it's all been certified to put in elector fraud, which was indicted again, more people yesterday. These aren't anywhere near official acts. And I would defend any president, including the former president's right, to not have wartime attacks reviewed in domestic court. That's not happening.
Right.
And I don't think they need to spin their wheels pretending that might happen someday.
They're going to invest.
The facts in front of them, they willfully ignored in a way that I'll close by saying, because I did wait my turn, right?
Yes,
What depressed me the most is not about the upcoming election or anything political. It was seeing multiple justices out themselves as insurrection and sedition minimizers today, and it was a sad day.
Yeah.